In the Bible, you will find many books, but surprisingly, of all of those books, only 4 dedicate themselves to the telling of Jesus' life and ministry. And all 4 tell the story of his teaching, his travels, his disciples, his miracles, his death. All 4 tell of his burial and resurrection. But those 4, again, surprisingly, don't necessarily agree on all the details of what happened on the morning of his resurrection. So today, we will study the 4 Gospels, all on the way to answering the question, what happened on Easter? Welcome to the Sky Pilot podcast that explores questions of faith, spirituality, and religion. I'm Dan Matthews, and I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the questions. Welcome to the podcast where every question is an invitation into a spiritual quest, and you're invited along for the journey. Hi, I'm Dan, this is Quark, and you're watching Sky Pilot Faith Quest podcast, the video version. Now, let me begin by saying that this podcast, I am not delving into the question of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, look, if you're a Christian, then you already believe in the resurrection of Jesus. If you aren't a Christian, then you probably don't. And my wading into those waters will almost certainly change no one's mind. I'm a Christian. I believe that he rose from the dead. So the question is answered suitably for me. Let's move on. Today we will take a different direction. It isn't about what happened to Jesus on Easter, but instead, what happened for his followers? Let's look at the 4 Gospels and see how their stories differ from one another. And this isn't about finding their flaws to determine who is right, but just being aware of the differences and what those differences might mean. So first, let's talk about the 4 Gospels as a group. The Gospels are the stories of Jesus' earthly ministry, but they can and normally are kind of divided into 2 subsets. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic is a word that means seen together. When they are looked at side by side, we can see remarkable similarities between those 3 Gospels.
Well, that's ridiculous. Of course there's similarities. They're telling exactly the same story.
Yeah, perhaps I did not say that well. Let me put it this way. If the 3 guys who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were taking the same college class together, and they had an end-of-semester paper to turn in, then Mark was the first to turn his paper in. Then came Matthew and Luke, whose papers bore so much similarity to Mark's that they would have been accused of plagiarism pretty much instantly. More than 3/4 of Mark appears in Matthew and in Luke, and I don't mean that the same stories appear. We would expect that to have happened. I mean the same stories are told using often nearly identical or very often just flat out identical language. So Mark was written first, probably around 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Matthew and Luke were written, say, 20 years after Mark, and then John, the last of the 4 Gospels, was written somewhere around the year 100, 110, so another 20 to 30 years after Matthew or Luke.
Okay, so what is it that makes John different enough to be separated from the other 3?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes scholars talk about things that are so academic or so subtle as to be lost on the average reader, unless that average reader can read the original languages fluently, and then that average reader wouldn't be really an average reader anymore anyway. Okay, but that's not true in this case. Let's look at the beginning of these books. Mark begins with John the Baptist and his baptizing Jesus in the Jordan River. Matthew begins with Jesus' genealogy and then the birth of Jesus. Luke begins with the most elaborate description of the birth story of Jesus. But here's where and why they are similar. All 3 are very focused on telling the story of Jesus. All 3 are very focused on telling the earthly story of Jesus the human from the very beginning of their narratives. They may begin at slightly different points, but they all seem to be interested in the same thing, Jesus on earth as a person. But here's where even a casual reader can see the difference between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. John doesn't begin there at all. John begins with a rather dramatic and poetic theological description of the nature of this kind of new understanding, this newly emerging understanding of this aspect of God. And it goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. Now, it doesn't take a scholar to see how dramatically different John is from the other three, does it? So let's start with the synoptics and see what they tell us. Also, let's agree to let go of the who is right approach to all of this. Instead, let's approach the differences between them from the standpoint of time having passed, and the new author is perhaps trying to tell a version that will speak to the readers of his time. So Mark, the first to be written, tells the story of the women approaching the tomb on Sunday morning with the intent of tending to the body of Jesus, which is something that would have been done after his death, immediately after his death, if they weren't prevented by the approaching Sabbath. Now, the Gospel of Mark has the women wonder, how are they going to remove the stone from in front of the tomb? Now, let me give a little background to this question. We often have the impression, because of this question, that the stone was put in place to seal the tomb so that no one would ever again enter that tomb. But the opposite is really true. The tradition of the times was to frequently visit the graves of loved ones, meaning to actually enter their tombs, and the stone was cut in a round shape to make the moving it out of the way as easy as possible. So even though the narrative has them concerned about the stone, it would have been possible for this group of women to have moved it aside. So the question of moving it is probably not intended to cause us to think how difficult this task would have been, but instead is setting up the surprise that is awaiting them when they approach the tomb. So when they reach the tomb, the stone has already been moved, and as they enter, they encounter a young man inside the tomb. We as the reader are expected to understand immediately that this is an angel. Maybe that didn't dawn on them, but we are expected to know that right away. Now, let me say that it would have been exceedingly rare for this to be a solo tomb. Poor people could not afford a rock-hewn tomb, but people who could afford it tended to own a space that was a room off of which there were multiple small niches called loculi. These tomb complexes were designed for families and were often used by them for generations. Think larger room with multiple places cut into the side walls of the room for the placement of the bodies. And then those bones would have stayed in one of those loculi, in one of those niches, long enough for the body to decompose, and there were just bones left, and then the family would take the bones and place them in a small stone box, an ossuary, I think is what they're called. So they would have been used for generations and generations. So when the angel and several women are all within the tomb together, we are almost certainly talking about a larger space that is not just a one-person tomb. Now, there are two interesting things about the Gospel of Mark, and one is that the angel tells them that Jesus is risen and that he is going to see them in Galilee. This seems to be a reoccurring theme throughout several of the Gospels, and there must have been a very early tradition that for the early church had some importance of linking the resurrection of Jesus and his first appearances being in Galilee. Here's another really interesting bit. Initially, the Gospel of Mark ended in the following way. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that was it. That's where it ended. It ended right there, which the followers of Jesus clearly realized pretty quickly that that was a horrible ending for this story. So eventually, there were another 10 verses added, and these 10 verses have the women telling the disciples about what they saw. It mentions Jesus having several appearances to the disciples, and then it adds the Great Commission, where Jesus sends his followers out.
Okay, how do you know this?
Oh, well, the oldest versions of Mark that we have found don't have this addition. Now, if we move on to Matthew, it's clear that the author felt Mark's version was a little Spartan and lacking in the descriptive elements to make a really good story. In Matthew's version, there's a lot of drama. The angel appears with an earthquake and rolls back the stone. And then, in a rather strange visual, The angel sits upon the stone like an impish leprechaun. By the way, impish leprechaun being my words, that's not in the Bible. Also, just as an aside, both of the angels in Mark and in Matthew's version are sitting, and it's kind of a strange posture, don't you think, for an eternal being who is God's messenger? I mean, they don't get tired, so why are they sitting? I haven't done a thorough search, but I don't know of any other places in Scripture in which angels sit except for the tomb appearances. So let me know if you can think of one that I haven't thought of. So Matthew clearly seems to have borrowed some of the imagery found in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, he has a vision of an angel, and Matthew is borrowing directly from that in some of his verbiage. The angel's appearance was like lightning. That's from Daniel 6. The angel, his clothes were white as snow. That is directly lifted from Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Okay, fine. It's from Daniel 7. Then the guard's reaction to the angel seems to be borrowed from Daniel chapter 10. Now, Matthew mentions that there are guards, while Mark makes no mention of them. There probably was, at this later point, as Matthew was written, some effort to explain away the resurrection. Non-followers, non-believers may have been suggesting that they, the followers of Jesus, had just stolen the body of their leaders. So the guards were added to the story to let the reader know, yeah, that's not what happened here. Matthew also has a strange twist. The angel promised that Jesus will see them in Galilee, so the women run away to go tell the rest of the disciples, and as they are leaving and making their way to those disciples, Jesus suddenly makes an appearance to them, which is absolutely contrary to what the angel just said would happen. So, was the angel wrong? Are we looking at a combination of two stories that were blended? Or perhaps Jesus was so excited that he couldn't wait any longer and decided to deviate from the plan. And I personally like that explanation. I kind of like the idea that Jesus is so excited by what is happening on this day that he just can't contain himself any longer, and he has to appear to them before he even thought he would. In the Gospel of Luke, there are now two angels. They ask why the women are looking for the living among the dead, and this seems to strengthen the idea that they are in a larger system of burial chambers, since the question would have made no sense if Jesus were buried in a solitary tomb.
Question, why are there now two angels?
Yeah, we're not really sure about that one, but one possibility is that Luke wanted the reader to see a connection between this story and the Transfiguration, which was the other moment in which two people appeared in glowing white garb. In Luke, the women bring the news to the disciples who don't believe them. The disciples thought it was nonsense. That word is actually in the Bible. Except for Peter, and we're not told that he believed them, but we are told that he ran immediately to the tomb and he saw it was just as they had said, but Peter didn't at that point believe. He was still puzzled as to what had happened. Now, on to the non-synoptic gospel. The Gospel of John is very different. Mary Magdalene is alone when she visits the tomb, only to find the stone moved and the tomb empty. But there are no angels at this point. She has no kind of revelation as to what's happening. She runs back to tell Peter and John because she assumes that Jesus has been taken by someone, and we can assume that she thought it was the authorities. The two of them, Peter and John, hear the news and they take off at a run for the tomb. John, being faster than Peter, gets there first and he sees it, just as Mary had said it was. And the linen that Jesus had been wrapped in was lying right there, but no Jesus. Peter and John, we'll assume, hang around for a little while, but eventually leave, and Mary remains outside the tomb, weeping. At that point, as she's alone, crying in front of the tomb, two angels appear in the tomb. They are seated, and they ask her, "Why are you crying?" And she answers, "They have taken Jesus' body." Then she turns around and sees Jesus, who asks her the same question, "Why are you crying?" And she doesn't recognize him at this particular moment. We're told she mistakes him for the gardener and asks him, "Do you have the body? Because if you have the body, just tell me where it is, and I'll go take care of it." Then he says her name, and she recognizes him. Jesus and Mary have brief words, brief conversation, and Jesus tells her to tell the disciples what she has seen. Mary now returns to tell them. So which of these, of the four Gospels, feels the most accurate? And the obvious answer to this is we have no way of knowing. But I will say this, that all of them have a level of accuracy, at least in terms of feel. If you're looking for the story that feels the most like an objective eyewitness story, I would say the Gospel of John. It holds together well and seems a plausible timeline and sequence of events. Mary comes by herself. She thinks the body's been stolen. She gets Peter and John. John outruns Peter. That seems like an arbitrary detail, so kind of possibly true. The men eventually leave. That seems pretty in character with them. Mary stays behind. Also seems pretty in character for her. Then Jesus appears to Mary. She does not recognize him initially. John has this theological moment in which Mary isn't going to recognize Jesus on her own. It's only with his help, his calling her name, that she finally recognizes him. Now, for me, the story told in John works and fits together really well as a story. But the tightness of the story in John lacks the chaotic elements that must have been true on that actual day. No wonder there are so many versions in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So let's forget for a minute that they were not all written at the same time. That day, Sunday morning, when the tomb was discovered to be empty, everyone was numb. Everyone was overwhelmed with grief. Everyone was exhausted. And then this unexpected stuff begins to happen. No wonder there are chaotic elements and differing elements to the story when we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That seems pretty accurate to what it would have been like had you asked the disciples who were there, the women who were there. You probably, in the midst of the chaos, would have gotten differing versions of the same story that they had experienced at the same time. The three synoptic gospels, as a group, accurately captured the differing version of the story that would have been told by the disciples, men and women, just a couple of days or even a couple of hours after the resurrection. And that's all for today. Just a comparison of the different versions of Jesus' resurrection as told in the four gospels. I think I have a slight fondness for the Gospel of John and the way the story is told there. I'm not saying that I think it's more accurate or that it's correct. Just the way John tells the story really speaks to me. How about you? Do you have a fondness for one of the versions or the other? Let me know. Tell me in the comments section below. Oh, and be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for this video. And on your spiritual journey, may you ask questions, seek answers, and boldly go wherever the quest takes you. Thanks for joining us here today and being part of the SkyPilot Faith Quest community. This is a great place to ask questions you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe asking in other places. And remember, the sign of a strong faith, solid religion, or healthy spiritual journey is not certainty, but that you keep asking questions.